Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I am Dr. Sarvat Rasool, and as you know I am teaching you the course on English novel. So our today's session is on Introduction to Henry Fielding and his work Joseph Andrews. Before we start with today's session, I would like to recapitulate the previous session. So here is the summary of the previous session. In the previous session, I gave you a general introduction to novel. I introduced novel as a genre and discussed important characteristics of novel. Then I moved on to English novel and shared with you a brief history of English novel. Tracing the history of English novel, I shared with you how novel passed through different stages of its development. As far as our today's session is concerned, this session has the following important aspects included in it. At the very outset of the session, I would introduce you to Henry Fielding, who is the author of the first novel that you would study in your course. The first novel that you are going to study is Joseph Andrews, that is written by Henry Fielding. So in today's session, I would talk about his birth, life, education, career, etc. With this, we would move on to Fielding's response to Pamela, that was a source of inspiration to write the novel Joseph Andrews. While I would be sharing important parts of Fielding's life, I would share the tragic part of his life that influenced his works. With this, we would move on to the influence of Richardson and his writing style on Fielding and his work. Since we are going to study the novel, its text and its critical analysis would be done in the upcoming sessions. So in this session, I would introduce you to important characters in Joseph Andrews. I think it would be appropriate to introduce you to the major themes of the novel Joseph Andrews before we start exploring the text. That is why major themes are included in today's session. Finally, towards the end of this session, I would give an introduction and analysis of the preface that Henry Fielding has written to this novel. Well, starting with Henry Fielding's biography, I would like to share that Henry Fielding was born in 1707 into a family that was essentially aristocratic. With this aristocratic background, of course, he had a lot of possibilities and opportunities to flourish. As far as his place of birth is concerned, he was born near Glastonbury in southern England and grew up on his parents' farm in Dorset. Talking of his ancestry, his father was a colonel and later a general in the army. His mother's father was a justice of the Queen's Bench, while his parental grandfather was an archdeacon of Salisbury. These two men, that is his father and the paternal grandfather, they played a very, very vital role in influencing Fielding to be interested in law, to have great love of learning, and above all to have a firm sense of Christian morality. When we talk of Fielding's father, his father, Sir Edmund Fielding, was a colonel of aristocratic descent, and he married Sarah Cloud in 1706. As it was a runaway marriage, and the father of the girl excluded Sir Edmund from the estate which he left for his daughter, when Sarah died in 1718, Fielding's father entered into a long battle with the maternal side of the family over the estate. I am sure you are able to understand that a writer, basically being a human being, is influenced by his or her circumstances. The surroundings in which somebody is brought up are reflected in his or her writings. That is why Tom Jones reflects a lot of influence of this episode in Fielding's life. It also reflects the early death of Fielding's mother and the ensuing divisions in the family. Both his works, that is Joseph Andrews that we are going to study, and Tom Jones, that is another popular work, depict a young man on the move until he is brought to a secure standstill by the revelation of his true identity. As far as Fielding's education and his career is concerned, after attending Eton College, where he was exposed to the classical authors, he developed interest in literature and writing. He joined his father in London, and in 1728 he wrote his first play. This implies that he was very young when he wrote his first play. Almost 30 more plays were written by him in the next 9 years. This was the period when the rake was to the fore in his character. The dismal account of Mr. Wilson's dissipation in London, that is shown in Joseph Andrews' book 3, chapter 3, that you would study later, represents a stern warning from an experienced Fielding about the dangers of city life. Before the city completely enveloped him, however, Fielding spent a short spell abroad at the University of Leiden in Holland. Anyhow, he returned to London in the fall of 1729. It was not a time of great theatre, but there was much material for parody and satire. In this context, Fielding used his potential for writing with such a vigour, particularly in the political field, that in 1737, the harassed Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole introduced a theatrical licensing act. Fielding wrote no more for the stage, but this experience as a playwright had affected his novels in a very, very positive way. It is due to this theatrical background that he had that perfection of dialogue and authentic patterns of conversations are found in his novels. Since play is written in the form of dialogues, and the writer has to imagine, has to put himself or herself in the shoes of the characters, and has to write dialogues that actually represent the real life conversations. So this experience helped Fielding write good conversations that he included in his novels. Since Fielding had married Charlotte Cradock in 1734 and they were passing through a financial crisis, it was his need for job that made Fielding change his profession. He took up the study of law at the Middle Temple 5 months after the passage of Walpole's Licensing Act. As far as the influence of Charlotte on him is concerned, critics believe that she was almost certainly the model woman and the model wife for Fielding's portraits of the ideal woman as he has presented in his works, such as Amelia, Sophia, and from Joseph Andrews, possibly Fanny Goodwill reflects some of such traits. We can also see Mrs. Wilson having some traits of the personality of Charlotte as reflected in Joseph Andrews. As I have already shared that Fielding and his wife were passing through a period of time where they were facing financial crisis, so in order to survive and to earn his bread, Fielding changed his course of career. From playwriting, he turned to journalism. As a journalist, he worked with some newspapers. For example, from 1739 to 1741, he edited a satirically political newspaper, The Champion. His job in this newspaper was as an editor, and as an editor, he did the job in quite an admirable way. This experience matured Fielding, and we can see a more serious Fielding emerging as a writer as the issues of the day come under his scrutiny. It was in 1740 that Fielding was called to the bar, but success as a magistrate was still something in far off future. He was still struggling with his career. Fate played an important role at this stage of his life. Chance joined hands with Fielding's rich experience as a dramatist and as a journalist to change the course both of his own life and that of the novel as a genre. It was in 1740 that Samuel Richardson published Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded. The novel was an immediate success. However, Fielding criticized it. Now, what was the criticism that Fielding laid on this work? Mainly, Fielding objected to the discrepancy between the expressed morality of Virtue Rewarded and the sexual content in the novel. Perhaps because he was poor and was in a financial crisis, in order to provide bread for his two young children, he decided to try and make some money with a parody of Pamela. However, whatsoever the reason, in 1741, he published his Writers and Body, an apology for the life of Mrs. Shamela Andrews. In it, Shamela is a fortune hunter who uses her virtue in a thoroughly lecherous and mercenary way. As far as the theme of Shamela is concerned, it is of disguise and pretense. And I would like to share with you that just the same theme is continued in his next work, that is Joseph Andrews, that was published in 1742. The novel Joseph Andrews we would explore in detail as a part of our course. As I have already mentioned that Fielding got a degree in law and he was called to the bar. So it was 1740 that he was called to the bar and he waited for his success. But the times when Joseph Andrews was published were very hard times for Fielding. The death of his father in June 1741 left him sorrowful. His financial crisis increased, and in March of 1742 his favorite daughter died. So situation was becoming harder and harder for Fielding, both financially as well as emotionally. It was in June 1741 that Fielding served his connection with the champion, and his disaffection with the patriots, as they were called, is perhaps reflected in his comments on patriotism in Joseph Andrews' Book 2, Chapter 9 as well. The kind of literary and political reputation he carried, it was difficult for Fielding to continue in the legal profession. His last two novels, that is Tom Jones and Emilia, also mirror this fact. The natural result of his financial problems created by this affected his family, and these novels show the suffering of a man who knows that he has brought some problems and poverty to the woman he loves. Yet, if Fielding could not get money by practicing law, he did use the subject of law in his writings, the works that he produced. For example, his Jonathan Wild, which was published in 1743, is filled with biting accounts of the grotesque malpractices in the system of criminal law. As you would go through the text of Joseph Andrews, you would see in certain episodes or in certain chapters, there are hints about the criminal law, and there are hints about the legal system and its corruption. In 1744, Fielding's wife died, and for a time, Fielding's friends thought that he would lose his mind. However, he took up his political pen again and wrote for the anti-Jacobite journal, The True Patriot. It was in 1747 that he married Mary Daniel, who had been a maid to his wife and had shared his grief when Charlotte died. From this time onwards, his fortunes began to brighten, and it was in 1748 that he was appointed Justice of the Peace for Westminster, and subsequently he was made Magistrate of all Middlesex, and in 1749 Tom Jones appeared. It is important for you to notice that his political, legal and writing career, they went along simultaneously. The concept of good nature, which played such an important part in Joseph Andrews, is also central to this novel, that is Tom Jones. This optimism is hardly the case with Captain and Mrs. Booth in Emilia, that were written in 1751. By now Fielding's health was not good and he was terribly overworked. Overworked Fielding in the summers of 1754 went to sea to Lisbon with his wife and daughter. Though the voyage resulted in a diary published posthumously, that is after his death, as a journal of a voyage to Lisbon, the quest for good health was in vain. He died on October 8, 1754 at the age of 47. So dear students, this was a brief biography of Henry Fielding, who is the author of the novel Joseph Andrews that we would study as the first novel in our course. I think it is important for the readers to understand, especially when students read a novel for academic purposes, to understand the text and the meanings and themes that are enveloped in the text. To understand them, knowing the author and his or her life story is very, very important. So I hope that the knowledge of Henry Fielding's life and the struggle he had to do during his life for his education and then later on for his career and financial aspects of his life would help you understand different episodes and different acts that are referred to at different points in different chapters of Joseph Andrews. Before we start exploring who are the characters in Joseph Andrews and what are the major themes, it would be appropriate to know the background in which, especially the literary background in which Joseph Andrews was written. Fielding had a very strong influence of Richardson's on his work, on the novels that he has written. As I have said earlier, Richardson's controversial Pamela, that is the novel Pamela, 1741 is the date of its publication. It was one of the great popular phenomena of British literary history that actually gave a new direction to British literature. It is the story of a teenage servant girl, Pamela Andrews. She withstands the unwanted attentions of her master, Squire Mr. B, and maintains her purity against all the odds. Near the midpoint of the novel, Mr. B recognizes her moral worth, reforms himself, and marries her. The second half of the story presents Pamela's triumphant acclamation to her new exalted condition, her conquering of the snobbish upper class by the sheer force of her goodness. As far as the form and structure of Pamela is concerned and its influence on Fielding's Joseph Andrews is concerned, I would like to say the entire novel comprises a series of letters and journal entries. That is the novel Pamela. A few of these letter entries are near the beginning and are written by other characters, but the vast majority of which are the work of Pamela herself. This epistolary format, that is the format that is based on episodes, written letters, is part of Richardson's revolutionary contribution to the development of novel in English. Now the question arises, what kind of contribution to the development of the novel in English? Well, the contribution is mainly in terms of form and structure. For the first time, for the first person narration of events in nearly real time allows the novelist to explore quite naturalistically the depths and nuances of Pamela's psyche. Dear students, as you would go through the text of Joseph Andrews, you would see that the same characteristics are used by Fielding in the novel that he has written. And though he has criticized Pamela on various grounds, a lot of inspiration is taken from Richardson's work Pamela to write Joseph Andrews. Well, moving forward, I would like you to be introduced to the major characters of the novel Joseph Andrews. The protagonist of the novel, that is you may call him the hero of the novel is Joseph Andrews, who is a handsome young fellow who tries to safeguard his honor throughout the novel. In the novel, you would also find Gaffer and Gammer Andrews. They are the parents of Pamela, and it is believed of Joseph as well. Another important character in the novel is Mr. Booby, that is the nephew of Sir Thomas Booby. Next character is Sir Thomas Booby, the deceased husband of Lady Booby, who does not appear as such in the novel as a character, but with the reference to him we are introduced to Lady Booby, that is a very, very important character in the novel. Lady Booby is a hot-blooded young widow who tries every way possible to seduce Joseph. So mainly the theme of chastity, that is one of the major themes of the novel, is developed through the character of Lady Booby and her efforts that she makes to seduce Joseph. Mrs. Slipslop is another character. She is a repulsive servant woman who also pursues Joseph. And by the way, she serves Lady Booby. Peter Pounce is the steward to Lady Booby. A very, very important character in the novel is Mr. Abraham Adams, who is a charitable curate. He is such an important character in the novel that sometimes it is argued whether Joseph Andrews is the hero of the novel or Mr. Abraham Adams. Another important female character in the novel is Frances Goodwill, and she is nicknamed as Fanny. Most of the times you would find references to her as Fanny. She is a beautiful young country girl and Joseph is beloved. In the novel there are the Wilsons. They are the real parents of Joseph Andrews that would be revealed later on. Lady Tittle and Lady Tattle are two gossips who represent all the kind of women who would be involved in that kind of gossiping. Plain Tim is a good-hearted host. Since it is a thick novel, you would come across a lot of characters, and all these characters at particular time points play important role in the development of this novel. So it is good to know about these characters that may sound to be minor characters otherwise, but they have a very important role in the development of the central character, that is of Joseph Andrews. There is a postilion who is a generous person who offers Joseph an overcoat to cover his nakedness. There is Mr. Tawwoos, a bumbling, good-natured innkeeper, and Mrs. Tawwoos is the wife of Mr. Tawwoos, the greedy wife of the innkeeper, who is a sheer contrast with the good nature of this innkeeper. We come across Betty, again a female character. She is a warm-hearted chambermaid who helps Joseph in the inn. So Betty serves at the inn whose owners are Mr. and Mrs. Tawwoos. There is Barnabas, who is a punch-drinking clergyman. Some other minor characters that play their role at certain points in the novel to develop the story are Tom Suckbribe, who is a constable, Leonora is a silly young girl. Horatio is a suitor who has no money but much love for Leonora, and there is Bellarmine, who is a suitor who has little love for Leonora but who hopes to inherit her father's fortune. So these two characters stand in contrast. Lindamera is again a gossip, whereas Mrs. Graveairs is a prude. Parson Trollope is a hypocritical country parson. You would come across his character as well. Then there is the peddler. The peddler is a man who reveals the secret of Joseph's parentage towards the end of the novel. We come across a lawyer who is Lawyer Scout. He is an unscrupulous lawyer, whereas Mrs. Adams, if you remember Mr. Adam, Parson Adam, who is one Abraham Adam, who is a very, very important character. We have Mrs. Adams, the wife of Parson Adams. Of course, she is a disagreeable wife. I hope this knowledge of the characters in the novel would help you understand as you would come across these characters while moving through the text. At the outset of the discussions that we would have on the text of the novel, I would like you to know the major themes that Henry Fielding has incorporated in this work. Later on, as we would move from chapter to chapter and episode to episode, we would see how these themes are incorporated. Right now, in the general sense of the themes of this work, I would like to share with you some of the major themes of this work. One of the important themes of Joseph Andrews, the novel, is duality of goodness. Goodness as a theme has always been prevalent in literature. As far as Fielding is concerned, Fielding presents the vulnerability and power of goodness at the same time. Well, this may sound strange that goodness is presented to be weak and powerful at the same time, but when we would go through the context of how it is, I would say in the context of 18th century literature, we can say that this is an age in which worldly authority was largely unaccountable and tended to be corrupt. Fielding seems to have judged that temporal power was not compatible with goodness. In his novels in general and in the novel Joseph Andrews specifically, you would notice that most of the characters, most of the squires, magistrates, fashionable persons and petty capitalists are either morally ambiguous or corrupt. Joseph Andrews as a novel is a very, very strong example of this fact. On the other hand, he presents characters from low class as symbols of good. For example, his paragon of benevolence, Parson Adams, is quite poor and utterly dependent for his income on the patronage of squires. Dear students, as you would go through the text of the novel, you would realize that interestingly Fielding shows that Adams' extreme goodness is one ingredient of which is ingenuous expectation of goodness in others, and this makes him vulnerable and weak in the face of odds. He is exploited by unscrupulous, worldly and money-minded characters. Fielding seems to enjoy humiliating his clergyman. However, Adams remains a transcendently vital presence whose temporal weakness does not invalidate his moral power. So this is the duality of weakness and strength, or of vulnerability and power, of goodness simultaneously. It is important to notice that if his naive good nature is no antidote to the evils of hypocrisy and unprincipled self-interest, that is precisely because those evils are so pervasive. The impracticality of Adam's laudable principles is not a criticism or judgment on Adam's or on his goodness. Rather, it mirrors the corruption of the world. Because in contrast to Adam's goodness, this corruption becomes even more visible. Another important theme that is dealt with in Joseph Andrews is of charity and religion. As a matter of fact, Fielding's novels are full of clergymen, and we find them in Joseph Andrews as well. Many of them are less than exemplary. In the contrast between the benevolent Adams and his more self-interested brethren, that is the other clergymen, Fielding draws the distinction between the mere formal profession of Christian doctrines and that active charity which he considers true Christianity. I would like to explain this point a bit more. What I would like to say is that Fielding's concept of religion was slightly different from what was prevalent during the times. And actually he has criticized religion and so-called religious practices that are more based on the formal profession of Christian doctrines, where the clergymen would only preach the Christian doctrine. What he was more interested in was the active application of these Christian doctrines, and more specifically to actively be engaged in charity. As you would go through the text, you would see how Parson Adams is a true example of this active charity. Fielding projects the idea of religious duty in everyday life and emphasizes its importance in daily human interaction. As I have said earlier, Fielding's concept of religion is very different. For him, religion focuses on morality and ethics rather than on theology or forms of worship, as was considered by most of the clergymen at that time. For example, Adams, as a mouthpiece of Fielding, says to the greedy and uncharitable Parson Trillibur, "Whoever therefore is void of charity, I make no scruple of pronouncing that he is no Christian." The third important theme that is incorporated in the text of Joseph Andrews is role of providence. If Fielding is skeptical about the efficacy of human goodness in the corrupt world, he is nevertheless determined that it should always be recompensed. When the good characters of Adam, Joseph and Fanny are helpless to engineer their own happiness, Fielding as an author takes care to engineer it for them. He is an omniscient and omnipresent writer who acts as a god to make things work out. His overtly stylized plots and characterizations work to call attention to his designing hand, and Fielding's authorly concern for his characters then is not meant to encourage his readers in their everyday lives to wait on the favor of a divine author. It should rather encourage them to make an art out of the business of living by advancing and perfecting the work of providence, that is, by living according to the true Christian principles of active benevolence. Explaining this point, I would say that Fielding's belief in providence and the role that providence or fate played in Joseph Andrews, the novel, by doing all this, mainly Fielding as author does not want to convey to his readers that they should leave everything to fate or providence. Rather, what he tries to transmit, or what he tries to convey to his readers, is that the readers should live their lives according to the true Christian principles and according to active benevolence. The next theme that is presented in Joseph Andrews is of town and country life. Fielding did not choose the direction and destination of his hero's travels at random. Joseph moves from the country to the town and then from the town to the country in order to illustrate, in the words of Martin C. Bettenston, a moral pilgrimage from the vanity and corruption of the great city to the relative naturalness and simplicity of the country. Joseph develops morally by leaving the city, site of vanity and superficial pleasures, for the country, site of virtuous retirement and contented domesticity. As his surroundings change, they have an impact on him. And the initial move that he made from the country to the town that had led him towards an exposure to the vices of the city, all these vices are nullified as he moves back to the country. Fielding did not have any utopian illusions about the countryside as well, as we can see through the presentation of bad characters in countryside setting. His claim for rural life derives from the pragmatic, that is very practical judgment that away from the bustle, crime and financial pressures of the city, there are more chances of the development of goodness. Explaining this point further, I would like to say that for Fielding, it is not the physical, geographical aspect of being in the town or the country that matters much. What matters much is that because countryside offers a lifestyle that has less financial pressures, less need for materialism, and it offers more simplicity in everyday dealings and interactions. That is why country life is, according to Fielding, more suitable for the moral development of goodness in a character. Since the novel Joseph Andrews is a thick work that mirrors the corruption and the problems of the times, there are a lot of themes that are incorporated in the development of the characters as they are shown developing, moving and acting through the novel. So another major theme that is prevalent and that actually Fielding has referred to in the preface of the work as well is the theme of affectation, vanity and hypocrisy. Affectation is what? Affectation जिसको हम कहते हैं ना बनावट, it is that. Fielding's preface declares that the target of his satire is the ridiculous, that the only source of the true ridiculous is affectation, and that affectation proceeds from one of these two causes. 1. Vanity. 2. Hypocrisy. Now, hypocrisy, being the dissimulation of true motives, is the more dangerous of these causes, whereas the vain man merely considers himself better than he is. The hypocrite pretends to be other than he is. So basically Fielding says कि बनावट or affectation is the cause of all the true ridiculous, and for him affectation or बनावट, it has two causes. One, he says, is vanity, the other is hypocrisy. Vanity means जब अपने आप को आप उससे बेहतर समझते हैं जो आप हैं, whereas hypocrisy means आप अपने आप को वो समझते हैं या अपने आप को वो शो करते हैं, जाहिर करते हैं जो आप नहीं हैं. Thus, for example, Mr. Adams is vain about his learning, his sermons and his pedagogy, but while this vanity may occasionally make him ridiculous, it remains entirely or virtually harmless. In contrast to this vanity, if you look at the theme of hypocrisy, you would see that by contrast, Lady Booby and Mrs. Slipslop counterfeit virtue in order to prey on Joseph, and it becomes a bigger source of ridicule. We would later on discuss these themes as they would occur, as we would come across them while going through the text. Another theme that emerges as a significant theme of Joseph Andrews is the theme of chastity. Fielding has a fundamentally positive attitude towards chastity. To him, people's sexual conduct be in accordance with what they owe to God, each other and themselves. In the mutual attraction of Joseph and Fanny, for example, there is nothing licentious or exploitative, and they demonstrate the virtuousness of their love in their eagerness to undertake a lifetime commitment, that is, marriage. Social class differences are a very significant yet very common part of the reality of any society. And Fielding's times or his society also were not exceptions. So the social class differences and the distinctions of social class, how they affect different aspects of human life, is an important theme of Joseph Andrews. The novel is full of class distinctions and concerns about high and low birth. But Fielding is probably less interested in class difference per se than in the vices that it can lead towards. In this regard, he aims at pointing out various vices such as corruption and affectation. Naturally, he disapproves of those who pride themselves on their class status to the point of degrading or exploiting those of lower birth. Mrs. Graveairs, who turns her nose up at Joseph, is an example of this. Fielding does not consider class privileges to be evil in themselves. Rather, he seems to advocate that some people deserve social ascendancy while others do not. This view of class difference is evident in his use of romance convention, whereby the plot turns on the revelation of the hero's true birth and ancestry, which is more prestigious than anyone had thought. If you remember, while introducing the characters, I hinted upon two sets of characters. One set that were considered to be or presumed to be the parents of Joseph Andrews, while the others who were later on revealed to be the true parents of Joseph Andrews. So these were the major themes that Fielding has introduced in his work. At this point, I would like to share that Fielding has given a preface to his work. Well, what is a preface? A preface is what we call in Urdu pesh lafz ya dibacha. And the purpose of writing a preface is to give an opportunity to the writer to tell the readers pre-hand what the work is about, what approach the writer has taken, and what does he or she as a writer expect from the readers, or what does he or she want the readers to take as an approach to exploit the text. Well, as far as the preface to Joseph Andrews is concerned, Fielding has written this preface for various reasons. The various reasons for which Fielding has written this preface include, or I would say may include, number one, to introduce the work. Number two, to explain what it is all about. Number three, to define the type and genre of the work he has written. And finally, or fourthly, to justify what he has written or the style that he has adopted for this work. To help you understand what I mean by all these points that I have just talked about, I would like to share with you the very first paragraph of the preface. Well, dear students, this is a time where I would like to emphasize that since novel is a thick text, I understand for Pakistani readers, sometimes when it comes to academic reading, it becomes difficult to read thick texts. In that case, the danger is that sometimes students do not read the text of a novel. Rather, they believe that just reading the summary or listening to a few important points in relation to the discussion of what is presented on those chapters, as would be the case with you, is enough. Well, I would say that is not going to be enough. The most important thing for you is to explore the text, to read the text. So please get hold of the text, be it in hard form copy or soft form copy, and as we would be going through the different chapters, you can pause, you can stop at any place, you can look at different paragraphs, you can read a few chapters, you can come back to my lecture or session, and before you actually listen to me, a reading of the text, a simple reading I would say, would help you a lot. Having said that, I come back to the preface of Joseph Andrews, and here is the first paragraph that I have just given here on the slide. Fielding says, as it is possible, the mere English reader may have a different idea of romance from the author of these little volumes, and may consequently expect a kind of entertainment not to be found, nor which was even intended in the following pages. It may not be improper to premise a few words concerning this kind of writing, which I do not remember to have seen hitherto attempted in our language. अच्छा, अब इस पॉइंट पे मैं आपसे कुछ चीज़ें शेयर करना चाहूँगी. पहली तो ये कि फ्रॉम टाइम टू टाइम I would show some selected parts of the text on the slides that I would discuss with you. In those you can notice a few things. Number one, the use of Old English, especially the spellings. Number three, you can also notice how the writer himself as the first person or as a third person narrator is present in all that. Right now, looking at the text that I have selected, that is the first paragraph of the preface, you can notice that Fielding is preparing the readers for the kind of writing he has written. He says that maybe general English readers who read this kind of books, they would have a different idea of romance, and when they would look at these volumes. Now the word volumes he has used because initially the work Joseph Andrews was published in 2 volumes. So he says that maybe the reader would expect to have a different kind of entertainment that this book neither provides nor it intends to provide. So he as an author wants to make it clear at the very outset, and he wants to say a few words concerning this kind of writing, about which he says that I don't remember to have seen hitherto, till this point, attempted in our language, that is English language. So it also shows his consciousness that this kind of writing pattern, this kind of genre has not yet been established as such in English. Anyhow, in the preface, Fielding sets out to define his terms and to differentiate Joseph Andrews from the productions of romance writers on the one hand and burlesque writers on the other hand. अब उस ज़माने में romance and burlesque were the 2 genres जिनमें बहुत ज़्यादा लिखा जा रहा था. Fielding has in the preface clearly mentioned that he is writing something that is different from these. He admits that he has included some elements of burlesque in his comic epic poem in prose. अब notice कीजिए please that he defines Joseph Andrews as what? Comic epic poem in prose. Epic poem अगर आपको पता हो तो epic is a type of a poem जो बहुत लंबी होती है, 12 books पे मुश्तमिल होती है. It consists of 12 books and it mainly deals with the heroic deeds or acts of the hero, उनको present करती है. और फील्डिंग ने क्या कहा? फील्डिंग ने कहा कि ये epic poem है in prose. So it has the qualities or characteristics of epic poem, but it is written in prose form. Poem की form में नहीं लिखी हुई. और फिर उसने कहा कि it is comic epic poem. It has comic epic elements. And then he says, but it excludes them from the sentiments and the characters because burlesque in writing, like caricature in painting, exhibits monsters, not men. अब वो burlesque के characteristics की भी बात कर रहा है, where he believes that they are caricatured in painting and they are exhibited as monsters, not men, but this is not the case with his writing. So he claims that he is presenting characters like real characters. Here I would share with you another paragraph from the text of the preface. Let's read this. Now, a comic romance is a comic epic poem in prose, different from comedy, as the serious epic from tragedy, its action being more extended and comprehensive, containing a much larger circle of incidents and introducing a greater variety of characters. It differs from the serious romance in its fable and action. In this, that as in the one these are grave and solemn, so in the other they are light and ridiculous. It differs in its characters by introducing persons of inferior rank and consequently of inferior manners, whereas the grave romance sets the highest before us, lastly in its sentiments and diction, by preserving the ludicrous instead of the sublime. In the diction, that is the language choice, I think burlesque itself may be sometimes admitted, of which many instances will occur in this work. As in the description of the battles and some other places, not necessary to be pointed out to the classical reader, for whose entertainment those parodies or burlesque imitations are chiefly calculated. I hope you would have noticed how he differentiates his writing, the type of writing that he has done, the kind of work of literature that he has produced in the form of Joseph Andrews. He tries to differentiate it from romance and comic romance and from burlesque. So while defining and defending his chosen genre, that is the comic epic or comic epic poem in prose, he claims the lost work of Homer as precedence. He also explains that the comic epic differs from comedy in having more comprehensive action and a greater variety of incidents and characters. He also says that it differs from the serious romance in having lower class characters and favoring in sentiments and diction the ridiculous over the sublime. तो बेसिकली उसने एट द आउटसेट प्रीफेस में क्लियरली बता दिया है कि वो कौन सी चीज़ें हैं जो उसने बर्लेस्क स्टाइल से और रोमांस स्टाइल ऑफ राइटिंग से ली हैं, और वो कौन सी चीज़ें हैं जो उसने उनसे नहीं ली हैं, एंड ही हैज़ इनकॉर्पोरेटेड हिज ओन वेज ऑफ राइटिंग. Fielding is particularly concerned to differentiate the comic epic and comedy generally from burlesque. No two species of writing can differ more widely than the comic and the burlesque. For while the writer of burlesque depicts the monstrous, the writer of comedy depicts the ridiculous. He further claims that the ridiculous only falls within my province in the present work, and accordingly goes on to define the framework of his novel. So he has told at the very beginning of the novel, actually before starting that in the preface, that his main aim, his province, his area of writing, what he is doing in this work is to deal with the ridiculous, not with the monstrous. His aim is not to provide examples of or instances of the bad things as such or the negative things as such. His purpose is to generate ridicule by pointing out things, so that while the reader laughs at all that, he or she also learns lessons. I would like to explain a bit more on the sources of ridicule as he has talked about them in the preface, because this is going to be an important theme in the whole work that you would deal with, and the thread of this theme would run through the whole work. Talking of the sources of ridicule, he says, the only source of the true ridiculous, as it appears to me, is affectation, to which Fielding assigns two possible causes, vanity or hypocrisy, जैसे मैंने आपको पहले भी while discussing the themes कहा था. He further defines them that vanity is affecting to be better than one is. The vain man either lacks the virtue or quality he claims to have, or else he claims to possess it in a greater degree than he actually does. On the other hand, hypocrisy is affecting to be other than one is. The hypocritical man is the very reverse of what he would seem to be. To explain his idea, Fielding gives the example of a greedy man pretending to be generous. The ridiculous arises from the discovery of affectation, and as hypocrisy is a more severe form of affectation than is vanity, so according to Fielding, the sense of the ridiculous arising from its discovery will be stronger than in the case of vanity. Commenting on this preface, I would say, in Fielding's analysis, the outstanding moral fault of his times, which is consequently the outstanding preoccupation of Fielding's writing, is affectation. That, to him, is the only source of true ridiculous. In this novel, Fielding seeks to oppose the forces of affectation by making vain and hypocritic people seem ridiculous, and for doing so, in the novel, he uses a kind humor that encourages solidarity among readers, who are implicitly assumed to be on Fielding's side. So just by creating laughter, by exposing the vain and hypocritical people, and by creating light-hearted laughter, kind humor through this exposition, actually he points out affectation. In inspiring readers to laugh at affected people, Fielding insinuates that society breaks down into two camps, the affected and the genuine. And his moralizing humor supplies readers with incentives, mainly a string of jokes and a sense of moral superiority, to join or to remain on the side of the genuine. तो जब रीडर ये देखता है कि अच्छा ये किरदार जिसका मजाक उड़ाया जा रहा है, how it is involved in some kind of affectation, चाहे वो vanity हो, चाहे वो the ridicule that is created through the other possibility. So by doing that, actually Fielding makes the reader join his club. Finally, Fielding addresses the characters of the novel, claiming that all are drawn from life and that he has made certain alterations in order to hide their true identities. Fielding also conciliates his clerical readers by emphasizing that the curate Adams, though he participates in a number of low incidents, is a credit to the cloth due to his great simplicity and benevolence. An example from the text is quoted here. They will therefore excuse me, notwithstanding the low adventures in which he is engaged, that I have made him a clergyman, since no other office could have given him so many opportunities of displaying his worthy inclinations. So he has chosen Parson Adams as a character to be an example of ridiculous, because he thought it would be the best possible way. Critically commenting on the preface, I would like to add that the existence of the preface, the careful definition of terms, the reference to painting and to the circle of incidents, and the promise of a happy outcome at the end all indicate the extent to which Fielding is in control of his novel. Before he wrote the novel, he clearly knew what he would do, which directions he would give to the story, and where he would end it up. The characters may have their own lives, but it is the essence of humanity viewed through the lenses of Fielding's own vision, which is presented to the reader. He asserts, I describe not men, but manners, not an individual, but a species, By the way, the quote is taken from Book 3, Chapter 1, that you would come across later. Already we are aware of his acute discernments, his breadth of vision, his firm sense of organization, and his belief in the essential goodness of human nature. Because at the end of the day, as a moralist, his purpose is to amend the ways of people, and the vices for which he apologizes in the preface are more than balanced by the character of Adams and by the fact that they are accidental consequences of some human frailty or weakness. I hope as we have gone through the preface of the novel, it would have given you clarity on Fielding's purpose of writing it and his consciousness of what kind of product as Joseph Andrews as a novel he was going to produce. With this we come to the end of today's session, but before that I would quickly like to give you a summary of the lesson. We started today's session with an introduction to Henry Fielding. I shared with you important aspects of his life, such as his birth, education, career, etc. With this we moved on to Fielding's response to Pamela, that was a source of inspiration for his work, Joseph Andrews. As we were moving through his life story, we looked at some tragic aspects of Fielding's life that affected his writing and his career as well. Influence of Richardson and his writing style, especially in terms of construction of plot and the organization in episodes, was also seen how it influenced Joseph Andrews. And because this is the first lecture on this novel, Joseph Andrews, so I considered it appropriate to introduce you to the characters in Joseph Andrews. I also briefly gave you the general major themes of the work that later on we would trace through the work. And towards the end of today's session, I gave you an introduction and analysis of the preface that Fielding has written to this work to justify why he has written this work. With this we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much.